Always love the camping theme. I smiled back, handed both of them sticks, and laid out the marshmallows and wieners. I'd put a lot of effort into getting the campground just right. Evenings around the campfire had been one of the highlights of my summers when my dad would take us out to the cabin. Even as a child, I had felt the spirituality and timeless zen of sitting around the fire with the trees looming in the semi-darkness. This fire had just enough poplar in it to cause the occasional pop, but not so much that it began to sound like gunfire. I'd edited out insects. We Bobs tend to be a little obsessive about realistic detail, but come on, who needs mosquitoes? Once everyone was properly set up and ruining perfectly good marshmallows, I started the meeting. One of our hunting parties ran into a dozen raptors today. They'd set up an ambush, and a pretty good one. I had to busterize one of them or we'd be down another settler. Bill shrugged. I've said it before. I know it looks like really intelligent behavior, but pack predators on Earth did that kind of thing all the time. It's easily explained by instinct. Get Jurassic Park out of your mind. Bob was grinning at me, so I just smiled and nodded. Yeah, okay, point taken. Anyway, Bob's automated surveillance system should be pretty valuable once we get it set up, especially with Bob's new and improved ordnance. Guppy ran the surveillance system on Eden for years, Bob said. It'll be interesting to wire up a dedicated Guppy to handle the job, though. No replicant oversight. You sure about that, Howard? Not entirely, I admitted. But I wouldn't dare suggest using up resources to build Bobs just for running guard details, you know? Bill and Bob said in perfect unison, Butterworth would have a cow. We all broke up in laughter. With certain notable exceptions, the Bobs all had similar senses of humor. What tickled one funny bone, tickled all. There were a few milliseconds of contemplative silence. I looked at Bob. How's it going with the Deltons? Bob smiled a sad smile and shrugged. Archimedes has a growing family now. Time marches on. People age, you know? It's starting to freak me out a little. I'm watching people I know live their lives, getting older. Bill and I both nodded. Immortality had sounded like a great idea back on Earth, but there were costs, especially when you became attached to ephemerals. I glanced quickly at Bill as I had that thought. I knew Bill was touchy about the use of that term, but no, he couldn't read my mind. I hoped I didn't have a guilty expression. Probably a good time to change the subject. We're ahead of schedule overall. We'll probably be finished decanting the settlers from Exodus 3 this week. Riker will be happy to get back in touch with our relatives. Bill and Bob both nodded. Bob said, I enjoy watching the exchanges, but I have to admit that it would be too painful for me to talk to them. I'm glad Riker is up for it. I keep seeing the resemblance to my sisters in people's faces, and it's gut-wrenching. I smiled slightly. I don't think anyone had ever come out and said it to him, but the common feeling was that Bob 1 had gotten an extra dose of original Bob's anxiety. He tended to get wound up about stuff like that. I said to Bill, before I forget, I need to contact Riker. I want to find out if he can locate some oak and scan it for me. Oak? Bill raised an eyebrow at me. If Riker can get a good enough scan, I should be able to print some real oak barrels. It'll take forever to print something biological, you know? I know, Bill. It's more a proof of concept at this stage. I'll have a printer doing nothing but making staves until I have enough. Bill looked confused for a moment, then grinned. Going into business? No, just doing my part to maintain morale. We talked for a few more milliseconds about miscellaneous items, then they signed off. And Guppy popped in with my next to-do. Oh, that one. I'd been putting that off. Butterworth was livid. This was no mere cow he was having, this was the whole herd. I listened, jaw agape, as he carpet-bombed his tirade with expletives. I hadn't even been aware he knew the F word. Turned out he was an expert in its use as a verb, noun, adjective, adverb, article, and several forms of punctuation. I made sure I was recording. Finally, he calmed down. Relatively. Sort of. So these others, moronic name, by the way,
Are going around depopulating planets just because?
Well, according to Mario, I noted that Butterworth couldn't quite suppress an eye roll. He didn't think much of our naming choices. They kill all the life on any planets in the system, then extract all the metals and rare elements.
And we're parked out here like a juicy target.
I looked down and took the time to rein in my tendency to sarcasm before answering. Colonel, it's not like you'd have been any safer on Earth. If anything, Vulcan is slightly farther away from where they appear to be operating. And Earth has been advertising its presence for a couple of centuries with radio pollution. The Colonel nodded, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. I felt for him. He had no doubt thought that the worst was over with the landing on Vulcan. Now we were all back in the frying pan.
So, what plans do the Bobs have, Howard?
Now I was on more neutral ground. Mario has built a bunch of scout Bobs, and they're checking nearby systems. He's going to keep building cohorts, and they're going to keep spreading out until they've mapped the others' depredations. Then we'll take it from there. Bill has turned his attention to methods of destruction. Unfortunately, the others are probably ahead of us technologically. We have some bootstrapping to do.
Keep me informed, please.
He wandered over and sat at his desk, rubbing his forehead. I enjoyed the few seconds of silence as he reviewed his notes.
Farm donuts,
he said, looking up at me.
Those appear to be exceeding expectations.
Yes, Colonel. Bill came up with a lot of engineering improvements while breeding up the plant stock for release on Ragnarok. He has something called free time? I hope to experience it someday. Butterworth snorted and gave me a wry smile. We were both going full bore getting the colony up and running. The fact that replicants didn't need to eat or sleep just meant that I was available 7 days a week, 22 hours and 13 minutes a day. Or 31:49 on Romulus. Scheduling was going to be a headache once the Romulan colony was up and running. Funny, I couldn't remember any science fiction stories that actually dealt with how you'd handle timekeeping on a new planet.
And that means, Butterworth continued, that we'll be able to set up the Spitz and Faith colonies on an accelerated schedule. I expect you're looking forward to your descendants coming out of stasis.
No one more than Riker, I grinned. I have to admit it's been a pretty popular program in BobNet. Butterworth grimaced.
BobNet. 7 billion people on Earth in the early 21st century, and Faith decided to replicate a nerd/engineer with a Star Trek fixation.
He grinned at me to take the sting out of the comment and reached for the disconnect button.
Until tomorrow, then.
17. We've lost a drone. Bob. May 2171, Delta Iridini. The conversation with Bill had been both awesome and depressing. The idea that humanity was down to 15 million people was devastating. On the other hand, it sounded like that number had come close to dropping to a big fat 0. On the plus side, I wasn't surprised that he'd cracked the subspace problem, but I was impressed by how quickly he'd done it. It left a small, nagging question in the back of my mind as to whether I could have pulled that off. How different from me was Bill? No matter. The problem had been solved. Bill and I were working on merging the VR source from our 2 independent development branches, and real-time communications between Bobs was now a reality, at least in principle. I grinned to myself at the idea of a galactic internet. There still weren't a lot of Bobs online, but that would change as Bill's message spread through the local sphere at the speed of light. I was overjoyed to find out that I had the official first contact position sewn up. But I doubted I would be the only one. Luke and Bender hadn't come online yet. I hoped they would eventually intercept Bill's transmissions so we could get caught up. Just in case, I instructed the local space station to periodically retransmit the Scut plans along their flight paths. One way or another, they'd eventually receive the plans. The lack of significant progress on Bill's Android project was a little disappointing. A lot of the basic tech was being developed back on Earth when original Bob was still alive, but it was proving difficult to put all the concepts together into an artificial body that could operate like a complete organism. Oh well, sooner or later, Bill would make some breakthroughs. Meanwhile, I had my own projects. Marvin had taken delivery of the exploration squads and was deploying them into his search grid, covering the Deltan's original territory. At the level of detail we were trying for, he expected to be finished in 3 months or so. I just lost a drone. Marvin popped into my VR unannounced. He had a perplexed expression on his face. Define lost. Have a look. He popped up a video window. It showed a panoramic view of Eden from several hundred meters in the air. The drone was flying a search pattern looking for clearings that could be potential former villages. Suddenly, the image began corkscrewing wildly and breaking up. After about half a second of this, the image disappeared. The hell? I muttered. I'm assuming that was an attack from above. It would appear so. I did a frame-by-frame, and this was the best I could come up with. He popped up a still image. It was out of focus and broken up by video interference lines, but there was an impression of something biting or chewing on the drone. I ran some filters and cleanup routines on it. The result is partly extrapolated. He switched to a second image. This one was still grainy and lacking in detail, but I could make out what appeared to be a large beak or muzzle filled with teeth. Wow, I said. I would sure hate for that to be the last thing I saw. Guppy, are we getting any telemetry at all from the drone? Marvin asked.
Negative. Attack likely took out the power system.
Well, I want to take a look at the wreckage. I'll set up a SUDAR search. Highly refined metal should stand out like a lamp in a cave. Marvin stood up, gave me a salute, and disappeared. The wreckage of the drone rotated slowly in the holotank. Marvin had found the destroyed unit several kilometers south of its last known location and had taken a full detail SUDAR scan. The drone was bitten almost in half and had 2 parallel claw marks dug into the shell. The units were designed to be lightweight. Unlike the Busters, there was no armor. Still, anything that could dent metal like that had to be dangerous. And whatever it was airborne. Scary. Then there's this. Marvin popped up a couple of images. One was a close-up of the damage to the drone, and the other was a close-up of some bones. Interesting. I reached out and pointed to a spot on the picture. That looks a lot like the bite impression on the drone. Yeah. I've got a number of similar examples. Whatever this is, it used to snack on Deltans. Could that be why the Deltans migrated out of their original area? My eyes got wide at the thought. They weren't moving to a more dangerous territory. The gorilloids were the lesser evil. Or they didn't know or care about the gorilloids. Marvin's voice was hushed. Then the gorilloids chased them over the mountain range to the location where we found them. We sat in silence for several milliseconds. Marvin finally broke the silence. I still don't have enough information to narrow the search. Well, we know they're big enough to eat a Deltan or pull a drone out of the sky. I did not like this. Not a bit. 18. It's getting worse. Riker, September 2172, Seoul. A crowd stood outside the police lines, hopeless faces, some crying, parents holding children by the hand, couples holding each other, wearing stricken looks. People who would be better off almost anywhere but here. 63 confirmed dead so far. The apartment building, a rundown 6-floor concrete structure with no balconies, now had a huge bite taken out of it at ground level. That it would have to be condemned was a given. I was more worried that it might fall over at any moment, crushing everything nearby. This wasn't a great neighborhood. By almost any pre-war standards, it would be a slum. Buildings all had their own power systems since the invention of dependable fusion, but the streets were dirty, unlit, and covered with graffiti. Windows and doors at ground level had long since been reinforced or completely covered over. Stains ran down the sides of the structures from weather, deteriorating paint, and contributions from birds. The people living in this favela hadn't been significant in any way. They weren't government or military or anything that would justify making them a target. Just people, probably unemployed, living on the edge of poverty. Most of them likely had no hope, no future, other than the possibility of eventual emigration to another star system. What was the point? What could possibly justify this? The perpetrators had attacked people with next to nothing and taken even that. Sometimes it shamed me to think that I used to be human. I accepted a call from the Brazilian minister. "This is the third attack this month, Riker, and there has been no progress in catching the perpetrators. What assurances can you give me that something will be done?" Minister Benedito looked more spooked than angry. Very probably he was worried about his job. Still, this wasn't the time to get my back up. "Minister, I'm not in charge of the investigation. Really, I'm not in charge of anything except the global emigration effort. I'm here as, well, a consultant. I will help out the investigation any way I can, but you have to look to your internal security forces to get this resolved. Plus whatever the UN can do, of course." I could see from Benedito's face that he didn't think much of my response, but it was all I had. I made mining drones available to the emergency personnel to help locate and extract bodies or survivors. I set up surveillance drones around the perimeter in case the terrorists tried to send in a follow-up attack, and I made sure that those in charge had a direct line to me. And mostly, I waited. This was, as the minister had said, the third attack this month. This was terrorism, pure and simple. And not even for any political end, as far as I could tell. There had been no announcements, no demands. Someone simply seemed to be out to get Brazil. Since Florianopolis was pretty much all that was left of the former empire, this was the natural target. 1,500 ships or 1,500 trips. The inexorable logic of mathematics mocked me. Minister Gerald, the representative from New Zealand, was holding forth again on my shortcomings, both real and imagined. He really hated me for some reason, and had since day one. Not that I cared, the man was a putz, but my orderly mind liked to have a link between cause and effect. Plus, if I was going to create this kind of reaction in someone, I would rather have an end game. Fighting some random idiot was a waste of energy. Today's rant was about the sabotage and our inability to deal with it. I let my public avatar display alert interest while I rolled my eyes in my VR. He finally ran down, and I prepared to offer a response, but the minister from the Maldives beat me to it. And beating a computer to the punch was an impressive feat. I wondered if I should do a systems check. The chair recognized Minister Sharma, and she stood up. "I'd like to thank the minister for giving us a summary of his speech from last session, which, if I recall, was also a summary from a previous speech. I'd be even more appreciative if it had been a prelude to some new information, or at least witty. Minister Gerald, you've obviously got a problem with the replicants. I'd like to ask you to take it offline so we can get on with actual business." The attention lights blinked rapidly, the remote meeting's equivalent of applause. Minister Gerald's face clouded up and he sat back, arms crossed. I made a note to send Sharma a thank you note. But she was right. He obviously had a pickle up his butt about replicants in general and me in particular. The next item on the agenda concerned the deteriorating climate. Several enclaves in the higher latitudes were approaching non-viability. 2 ships, Exodus 4 and Exodus 5, were due to launch this month. The UN had confirmed that the island nations would be sent to Poseidon. The question on the table was whether we needed to switch the order of emigration or whether we could just move the troubled enclaves into the vacated territories. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion seemed to be different. I leaned back and looked around. I just realized that Homer wasn't here. He usually popped in to mock the UN meetings. I think I was starting to depend on his satirical take on things to get me through the tedium. Looked like I'd have to get through this one the old-fashioned way. I activated Sandbox Bob and handed off the video window. Freedom. 19. Pray. Bob, June 2172, Delta Eridani. Archimedes patiently tied 2 strands of vine together while the cub watched. I smiled, observing the tableau in the video window. His mate, Diana, kept one eye on the drone. She had never liked the drones, or me, and still tensed up when one was around. Having a child to protect just made her that much touchier. Archimedes was oblivious. He was too busy teaching his cub basic skills. The cub took the vines and, tongue sticking out of a corner of his mouth, tied a perfect granny knot. Archimedes sighed and corrected it into a square knot. The cub smiled up at his father, and I experienced a jolt of, well, something. Pride? Envy? Wistfulness? Maybe all of the above. It was hard to sort out. My eyes were watering, and I had to suppress a strong urge to re-watch one of the recordings of Riker's chats with our family. I minimized the window and turned to see Marvin watching me. He said nothing, and after a moment he dropped his eyes and went back to what he was working on. I took a few deep breaths and brought the window back up. The cub had successfully executed a square knot, although he still didn't seem to be clear on the difference. I chuckled. I'd given Archimedes some sailing knots over the last while, and he was learning them, one at a time. It looked like he was trying to pass that knowledge on to his cub. The boy would be given a naming ceremony as soon as he said his first word. Both Archimedes and I expected that to happen earlier than average. The Deltans quite reasonably considered language to be the difference between them and animals, and the first use of language was the proof that the child had, for want of a better word, a soul. The Deltan word didn't quite mean the same thing, but it was close enough. Diana was still eyeing me, so I decided to give her a break. I told Archimedes that I was going to go for a cruise around, then took off. I brought the drone up to a kilometer altitude and rotated slowly. It was still early in a beautiful spring day, and dew sparkled on the trees and grass. This part of Eden was mostly forest, but there were enough meadows and open areas to allow grazing animals to make a living. I was making a point of recording panoramas like this whenever I could. Someday, maybe 10,000 years in the future, the Deltans would be civilized and would probably have done something to Eden similar to what humans had done to Earth in the 20th century. It would be nice to be able to show them what their world had once been like. I wondered if I would still be hanging around here by then. Wow, I needed to shake off this melancholy mood. I enjoyed hanging with Archimedes, but once in a while it triggered images of my parents and sisters. When that happened, a change of scenery was in order. I instructed the drone to fly back to Camelot and take up station keeping, and I switched to a drone stationed at one of the LaGrange auto factories. The armaments project was overdue for inspection anyway. I had a section, carefully separated from everything else, where I was experimenting with explosives and munitions manufacture. I was playing with the idea of a shell powered by plastics instead of gunpowder. A primer triggered by an electrical current would remove the need for a hammer. Using ethylene glycol as the binder would result in a compound that was usable under all environmental conditions, including extreme cold. And the stuff didn't become unstable with age. Oh, and it was easier to work with safely than gunpowder. I moved on to the main auto factory area. 4 replicant matrices were currently nearing completion to give life to the version 3 Heaven vessels lined up nearby. I hadn't decided yet if I wanted to upgrade myself as well. Granted, the 3s were significantly faster than my version 2 hull, but I had no immediate need for speed. Everything in the Delta Eridani system was accessible by drone. I seldom had any need to fire up my surge drive. Come to think of it, I hadn't left orbit around Eden in years. Despite my ongoing reluctance to replicate, I felt a moral obligation to get more of me out into the universe. Besides the simple fact that more Bobs exploring meant more interesting revelations, There was the implied promise to Dr. Landers to perform the task that he'd resurrected me for. By extension, I had a responsibility to what was left of the human race. Riker was doing a magnificent job of getting them off planet. It was up to the rest of us to find places for them to go. My brooding was interrupted by a text from Marvin. "There's been an attack." I sent the drone back to station keeping and re-entered my VR. Marvin was waiting. "Gorilloids?" I asked, sitting down. "No. I think it might be our giant claw. A foraging party was out gathering food when one of them was grabbed. They say they couldn't really see it, except they got the impression it was really big. It flew away with the victim, and everyone else hightailed it back to Camelot." "What do you mean they couldn't really see it? Did it jump out of a tree?" No, that's the thing. They were looking right at it, but couldn't make it out. The Deltans didn't really have a word for it, and the translation routine was having fits, then finally settled on invisible." Ah, jeez. So a giant flying thing that can become fully or partly invisible, or maybe blend in. I trailed off as I watched Marvin's eyes get bigger. He flipped through the archives and pulled up a video segment from my early investigation of Eden, back before I'd even found the Deltans. The video depicted what I'd named a hippogriff, about the size of a robin. This little critter had 4 legs and a set of wings. It was predatory, and it could hide in plain sight because it could change its coloration to match the environment. Oh, crap! They'd be a lot bigger than this little guy, but what the Deltans sort of saw would fit the bill. I nodded at Marvin. "Good catch, but we still don't know where it comes from, right?" Marvin shook his head. "I'm still searching outward from Camelot. I've reached the ocean in one direction, but still lots of land left at the other compass points. I'm biasing it towards the original Deltan territory, although that's not a sure thing either." "The big question," I said slowly, "is whether any of our drones saw it." I already checked. There weren't any in the area. Everything we could spare is out searching. Somehow, this thing snuck inside our perimeter. Wonderful. Wonder-freaking-full. I haven't just brought the Deltans back to the fire, I've put them back in the frying pan. Some sky god. I watched from a distance as the tribal elders gathered to discuss the recent death. I wasn't invited to attend, since I was probably the subject under discussion, and I didn't feel like forcing the issue. Archimedes was told to be there, and he looked nervous enough for both of us. He and Diana exchanged frightened looks before he left. The meeting went on for quite a while, and there was a lot of gesticulating and yelling. I'd probably never mentioned directional microphones to the Deltans, so I guess I couldn't blame them for not realizing that I could hear everything. Archimedes passed on my theories, which in retrospect probably made things worse. But it would have come out sooner or later. The central theme of the meeting, though, revolved around whether I was malicious or just an idiot. Either way, a lot of people believed that they'd been safer back at the old site. Objectively, that wasn't true. They'd been slowly going extinct and wouldn't have lasted more than another generation or so. But explaining population trends to essentially innumerate people was a losing game. They understood death when it happened in front of them, far better than they understood attrition. The meeting took about 2 hours. When Archimedes came back to his spot, he looked very hangdog. He sat down and accepted a piece of jerky from Diana. "They're about evenly split," he explained. "Half think you've led us here to be food for the flying things. The other half ask how you could have known about these things if we didn't know, and we're from here." I thought about that and sighed. If the Deltans had been human, those would have been the two camps, but the split wouldn't have been 50-50. Deltans were surprisingly rational. "You're not in trouble, are you?" "Not really." Archimedes glanced at Diana and smiled ruefully. "But my, stock is down. I think that's how you say it. Don't worry about it, Archimedes. You're still the best damned weapon maker in, well, anywhere. If you need to distance yourself from me for a while, that's fine. But either way, Marvin and I will continue to look for the hippogriffs. Archimedes nodded. His cub toddled up and dropped into his lap, head first. Well, that explains it, Marvin said. I stopped at the shoreline, and I shouldn't have. The things seemed to be centered on a rookery out on this island. Marvin pointed to a large island a kilometer or two offshore, obviously volcanic in origin. It was steep, deeply folded, and very probably had a lot of lava tubes that would make perfect homes for large, flying things. How many of them are there? Can't tell for sure, Marvin shrugged. They're always coming and going during the day, but unless I start tagging them, I don't know how many nests or dens or whatever are in those caves. But certainly scores of adults, at minimum. I frowned. That's a significant population of predators, so what do they eat when they can't get Delton? Marvin waved up a picture. Seals, well, seal equivalents. Or maybe closer to walruses. They seem to fill the same niche. They spend most of their downtime basking on the beach, and they hunt in the water. They're a little more mobile than seals or sea lions, but still basically sitting ducks on land, although I'd imagine they could do some damage with those tusks. I stared at the picture for a few milliseconds, rubbing my chin. I turned to the globe and expanded it until it showed just the island and the Delton's past and current range. So the hippogriffs discovered the Deltons, who were probably easier prey, chased them out of their original territory. Marvin continued the thought. Then eventually caught up with them after they moved into gorilloid territory. The Deltons could handle the gorilloids with flint weapons to help, but they couldn't handle both predators. They retreated over the mountain range, which put them out of range of the hippogriffs but lost them the flint resource. Without that, they couldn't quite hold their own against the gorilloids. I finished. And then we, and by we I mean you, led them back to the flint site, where they are, once again, on the menu. Marvin gazed at me with one eyebrow raised. So, what now? I sat down, called up coffee, and leaned back in thought. I think we can agree that just doing nothing is off the table? Marvin nodded, and I continued. Likewise, asking the Deltons to move again is probably a non-starter. I doubt they'd do it even if I had a good, safe destination in mind. Plus, the Flint site really is their best long-term bet, generally speaking.
Approaching predator detected.
We both looked up at Guppy's announcement. We'd used all available drones to set up a tighter perimeter around Camelot and set them to looking specifically for anything large and airborne. It appeared we had a bite. I pulled up the video that Guppy offered. The hippogriff was hard to make out. On a clear day, it would have been almost impossible to see. The blue of its hide matched the sky so well. But today there were too many scattered clouds for the animal to camouflage itself from all angles. It was heading directly for Camelot. There was no doubt in my mind of its intentions, and this was almost certainly the one that had taken the Delton 2 weeks ago. Right, let's busterize it. I called up a buster and set it to full acceleration. It shot towards the hippogriff. At the very last moment, though, the hippogriff dodged the bullet. Literally. This thing's speed and aerial agility was unbelievable. We both stared for a few milliseconds, then I called up more busters. Don't overdo it, Marvin cautioned. Let's find out what the animal is capable of. We know we can get it if we throw enough busters at it. Let's find out what enough means. I nodded at him and ordered most of my second wave to stand down. Instead, I sent in 2 busters in the fore-aft formation that Riker and I had used so successfully in the Battle of Seoul. Again, the hippogriff dodged the first buster. The speed of the animal was really impressive, but it was unable to correct for the second one. The splat created a cloud of fine red mist, which settled slowly to the forest below. I didn't like that, Marvin said. We got it with the second one, but it was close. I think if we want to take them out dependably, we should go with an encirclement using 3 or more busters. The question is whether this was a one-off, or whether they fly some kind of patrol pattern. Maybe there won't be any more coming this way. Marvin didn't look convinced. Predators almost always have a patrol pattern of some kind, if only to protect their territory from competitors. I doubt we've seen the last of them. It took less than a day to prove Marvin right.
Multiple incoming detected.
Oh, God, this just keeps getting worse. I pulled up the window and leaned forward. It was hard to tell from the returns, but it looked like about a dozen hippogriffs, give or take a few, were bearing down on Camelot. "What the hell?" Marvin said, popping in. "What's attracting them?" "Just a guess, but I'd say the blood in the air yesterday from the busterized hippogriff. I'm sure a predator would be able to smell the spoor from miles. Maybe it draws them like sharks." Okay, a dozen of them will require 36 busters. We don't have that available. We're going to have to wing it, Marv. They're in a fairly tight group. Maybe we can thin them out some of the first pass. Marvin nodded, and we called up the 20 busters that we had available. I ordered Guppy to fly in reinforcements from orbit, and we set the ones we had on a direct line of attack with maximum acceleration. By the time they neared the flock of hippogriffs, they were doing about Mach 1.5. The first pass took about 5 hippogriffs and allowed us to see that there had been 14 total. Now we had 15 busters left for 9 attackers. There was a good possibility 1 or 2 might reach Camelot. While the busters were coming around for another pass, I activated one of the drones in Camelot. I flew towards the first recognizable face I saw, which was Arnold. Everyone was looking in the direction of the sonic booms, staring at the red clouds that had appeared. I shouted at Arnold, "Hippogriffs coming, get everyone under cover." I shifted back to my VR without waiting to see if Arnold reacted. The busters were just coming in for the second pass, and Marvin had stacked them 2 deep. The leftover buster trailed the group, ready to take out a target of opportunity. The second pass took out 3 hippogriffs and injured the wing of a 4th. The clouds of red were now making it hard to see. Sudar was not particularly effective with biomass. Bodies showed up as dim ghosts, and Infrared was having a lot of trouble with all the fresh blood floating around. The injured hippogriff lost altitude quickly, but it was a controlled descent. We probably couldn't depend on the impact killing it. We now had 11 busters. No, 9. 2 busters had collided and taken each other out, and 5 attackers left. It was going to be tight, unless they turned around and retreated. If they were anything like sharks with blood spoor, though, that wasn't going to happen. The busters came around for a 3rd pass. There were fewer hippogriffs now, though, and they were spreading out, and the damn things really had quick reflexes. Despite buster pairing, we only took out 3 of the attackers. We were down to 6 busters and had 2 healthy and 1 injured hippogriff to deal with. Still reasonable odds, except that they were now close enough to Camelot to present a real danger, and we didn't have the uninterrupted line anymore for a supersonic approach. Switch to bludgeoning and harassment. Guppy, where are the reinforcements?
5 minutes out.
Not good enough. I checked the action in Camelot. The mesa didn't have much in the way of caves or any other kind of overhead protection. It was ideal for protection from a ground assault, not an air attack. The Deltans were streaming out of the village down the 2 available paths, but with the bottleneck, they couldn't get the whole tribe evacuated in time, and they would be sitting ducks until they reached the trees. We commenced low-speed bludgeoning of the hippogriffs. They were even better at dodging at this speed, but they couldn't really do anything else at the same time. We finally managed to bounce one off the head of a hippogriff. It went down immediately. The other hippogriff ignored the byplay and tried to take a pass at the Deltans on one of the paths, but the busters kept it too distracted and it passed overhead without completing the attack. Unfortunately, a couple of Deltans panicked and fell or leaped off the path. I could see them tumbling down the steep scree. The Deltan hunters laid into the unconscious hippogriff. It was my first opportunity to get a good feel for relative scale. If the Deltans were human-sized, then the hippogriffs were about the size of a Clydesdale, with bat-like wings. The animals looked more reptilian than anything. Teeth and claws were disproportionately large, resulting in an impression of something built for nothing but killing. It took only a few seconds for the Deltan hunters to ensure that the animal wouldn't be waking up. The live hippogriff, though, was still a major threat, and I had no idea where the injured one had gotten to. The busters continued to harass the healthy hippogriff and had apparently decided to reduce the defensive zone by landing. Well, not a bad strategy, really. Now the busters could only buzz it from above. As it landed, the hippogriff changed its coloration to match the ground and rocks, but no one was going to be fooled at this stage. The animal snapped at the busters as they came within range, and it managed to snag one. It looked as though this would turn into a process of attrition, until the Deltons brought in their A game. 20 to 30 spears flew at the animal in a solid cloud. Fast or not, the hippogriff simply couldn't dodge that amount of incoming. Within moments, it resembled a pincushion. The hippogriff screeched and snapped at the spears sticking out of it. Arnold grabbed another spear from someone, ran straight toward the hippogriff, and made an Olympic-caliber throw from point-blank range. The spear went right through the animal's neck, and it dropped instantly. There were cheers from the hunters. The jubilation lasted only a moment, however. Screams from the retreating tribespeople brought our attention back to the paths out of Camelot. The injured hippogriff had made its way up to the base of the scree, found one of the people who had fallen, and was eating him. I sent all my remaining busters straight at it, with no allowance for pulling up if they missed. 2 impacted with enough force to kill the last animal. It was too late for the Delton, though. The good news, if it could be called good, was that we'd only lost 3 Deltons. A 4th had a broken leg, and I was going to have a confrontation with the medicine woman if she didn't listen to me this time. I'd lost 18 of my 20 busters. 20 more made it down from orbit, too late to do any good. And once again I was pulling all my printers off of their assigned duties to make more busters. The Deltons had called another tribal council. For them, 2 councils in a month was akin to panic. This time I was invited. Or maybe summoned. I doubted it was to give me a medal. I had noticed that some people were giving Archimedes a bit of cold shoulder. They couldn't overdo it, of course. He and Moses were still the only source of shaped flint, and Moses wasn't moving around much these days. If I was to describe the attitude in human terms, it would be coldly formal. Since Archimedes hadn't done anything to deserve it, I had to conclude that it was guilt by association. Arnold was sitting in council now. After that display with the hippogriff, he was man of the hour. Hopefully that would mean at least one sympathetic voice. There was some discussion among themselves, then they called me over. I floated down to head height and waited.
"Are there any other surprises that you have for us?"
Hoffa said without preamble. That was a surprise to me, too. You'll remember that I asked why you'd left Camelot. Only Axler had an inkling, and he didn't remember enough to warn us.
"Just the same. By following your advice, we seem to get deeper and deeper into trouble."
By following my advice, you've retaken a location that you can defend against gorilloids and that has flint for weapons. I know a lot of you have trouble following my explanation, but I maintain that in the old camp your children would have been the last of the Deltons. I paused for dramatic effect before continuing. As for the hippogriffs, they're a problem because they're a surprise. I'm going to find out more about them, then I'm going to remove them.
"I've noticed,"
Hoffa said,
"that despite your talk, it's still we who do most of the fighting."
Really? When was the last time a group of your hunters had to beat off a gorilloid attack? Did you hear the sonic booms? 2 hands and 4 hippogriffs approached Camelot, but only 3 arrived. Hoffa's ears were straight back and his eyes were narrowed to slits. I was mishandling this, but I couldn't stop myself. I'd never been able to handle short-sighted stupidity.
"That's 3 more than would have arrived at our old camp."
In VR, Marvin and I rolled our eyes in sync. "I've already talked about that."
"Perhaps next time we should leave your Archimedes out as an offering for them."
I sent the drone straight up 10 feet.
"Don't ever threaten my family. Not ever."
As I finished saying the words, I realized that I'd turned the volume up. It had probably been painful to sensitive Delton ears. The entire council was cringing, and possibly not just from the volume. I slowly lowered the drone back to head height. I mean it, Hoffa. I'll take care of the hippogriffs, and thanks to you, I figured out how. Hoffa looked confused and somewhat concerned. I noticed that Arnold looked at Hoffa and smiled. Okay, I'll bite. Marvin was grinning at me. How, and how did Hoffa help with it? I glared at him. I'm going to drop a rock on the island, which is what I wanted to do to Hoffa. Geez, Bob, here you go again. You're going to perform planetary ecological surgery just because it's convenient. No, Marvin. I jumped to my feet. I'm going to do it because those things threaten my family, and you can analyze that all you want. I don't give a damn. I closed down his VR connection, and he disappeared, effectively kicked out. Pretty rude, and I'd be apologizing later. But for the moment, I was too steamed to care. I had a far more immediate problem, though. Assuming I was right about the hippogriffs smelling blood, then today's battle would bring yet another wave tomorrow, maybe much larger. It would take time to find a large enough mass to destroy the island. I calculated an initial size of 100 tons would about do it. We had identified a number of nickel-iron asteroids in the system, some of which would be about the right size. I received a ping from Marvin. It was time to eat crow. I invited him in, and we looked at each other warily. He broke the silence first. You know we're no good with this crap, right? It was enough. I broke down laughing, and we nodded at each other. Done. Possibly identical twins could come close to understanding, but certainly no one else. We sat down, and I described my thoughts on the impactor. Huh, he replied. So, a couple of months to build Bill's asteroid mover, a couple more weeks to move the asteroid into place. You think the hippogriffs will just wait around? I'm open to suggestions. I understand you're angry, Bob, and you want to smash the island to smithereens. But all you need to do is hammer it enough to take out the hippogriff population. You don't need a Yucatan-level event to do that. I nodded. So, a bunch of small impactors? A 1,000-pound steel ball will do a lot of damage. Oh, I nodded. Ship busters. Yeah, I've still got 4 in inventory. The thing is, though, Bob, you don't want too big of a bang. Tsunamis, ground shocks, flying debris could do more damage to the Deltans than a bunch of hippogriffs. Get this wrong, and you could be directly responsible for the extinction of the Deltan species. I nodded, shocked. Time to get my temper under control. We decided to use the shipbusters one at a time and gauge the results after each strike. I sent the first shipbuster in at what I hoped was a reasonably sedate velocity. The results were slightly more, spectacular than expected. In retrospect, maybe I didn't allow for the amount of material that would normally be shed by a meteor on the way down, or I forgot to carry the 2. Whatever the reason, the impact produced a mushroom cloud that would have done a fission bomb proud. As the smoke and dust cleared, it was obvious that the island and the hippogriffs were gone. Well, that was the good news. The bad news was that this was definitely going to produce ground shocks all the way to Camelot, and at least some debris. I flew several drones over to the camp to find everyone already awake, staring at the bright cloud to the southwest. Archimedes looked up at the drone as I arrived. "Did you do that?" he said in a hushed voice. I wasn't sure of the expression on his face. Awe, certainly, but I thought maybe a bit of fear. I hope not. That wasn't the legacy I wanted to leave. Yeah, Archimedes, that's the Hippogriff Island being obliterated. Archimedes' eyes grew wider and his ears went down. He took a half step back from me. Damn. At that moment, the ground shock arrived. It wasn't the worst earthquake I'd ever seen, but was probably the first in the Deltans' experience. They hugged the ground, and there were many screams. The shaking was brief. It was followed a few minutes later by the sound of the explosion. The crack and roar seemed to go on forever, but couldn't have been a minute in all. The Deltons continued to huddle until it let up. But now came the hard part. I went to the elders. There may be some burning rocks falling from the sky in about 100 heartbeats or so. You should get everyone into the lee side of the bluff. There were wide eyes and flattened ears, but no one was going to argue with me. In short order, every Delton was huddled behind the central bluff. The debris arrived right on time. Drones hadn't been able to detect anything big. I hoped that would hold, as I wasn't really sure I could intercept incoming debris with a buster, or if it would do any good. The pelting lasted several minutes. It was impressive, and there was some minor damage to the village, but no one was hurt. The Deltons huddled for the rest of the night, unwilling to leave the sanctuary of the rock. When morning finally came, people spread back out to their normal locations. A few of them had to do some cleanup, but their neighbors pitched in. Overall, the amount of actual damage was minor. The council was having yet another session. Again, though, I wasn't expecting a medal. When they were done, they motioned to the drone. I flew it over, and Hoffa stepped forward.
We understand what you've done. We understand your explanations. But everything you ask, everything you do, seems to come with a larger and larger cost. We're not sure if we're better off now or not. There's a lot of argument about that.
He paused for a moment, a determined look on his face, then faced me squarely.
We'd like you to go away. We'll face our fate ourselves. If you want to kill us, we can't stop you. If you want to kill me, I can't do anything about it. But you're not welcome here anymore.
I stared at him through the drone for what seemed like forever. I was frozen, numb. It was too much to process. The emotional circuit breaker had tripped. I'd lost a family already. Now I was losing a second one. I backed out of the drone and turned to Marvin. His face was gray. I was sure I didn't look any better.
I guess I screwed up,
I said. Look, let's just clear out for now, he replied. Give things time to cool off. You can talk to Archimedes later. I nodded and re-entered the drone. I floated over to Archimedes, who was not looking well. Deltons didn't display shock the same as humans. His facial fur was lying in disorganized mats, but the wide eyes and flat ears were probably universal. A disconnected part of me started theorizing about why that might be, and I squashed it. Archimedes, I'm going to take off until things cool down. I'll talk to you later. He nodded. I noted that Diana had a look on her face of either satisfaction or triumph. I'd never hated anyone as much as I despised her at that moment. 20. Parasite. Howard. October 2189, Vulcan. Things that make you go, ew! This definitely qualified. I couldn't take my eyes off the video as the doctor made an incision on the patient and proceeded to extract a small bundle of eggs. A few had hatched and the larvae were trying to burrow away. At that moment right there, I was so thankful that I was no longer biological. I glanced at Butterworth's video feed and noticed that he was paying an extreme level of attention to his glass of Jameson. Not a bad idea. I invoked a glass of Sam's cognac and turned on my alcohol receptors. A slight buzz was just what the doctor ordered. Finally, thank the universe, the video ended. Butterworth turned to look at the video camera. A slight smile formed when he saw the glass in my hand. I shrugged a what-about-it shrug.
The parasite appears to be a large insect, he explained. The bite itches a bit, then disappears. When the eggs have grown enough, though, it becomes a large swollen area. By that point, we have less than a day to remove the eggs.
What if you don't? I knew I would regret asking, but I couldn't stop myself.
The larvae go for the heart, fatal within 2 days or so.
Then the larvae feast on the corpse. That appears to be the life cycle. We've lost 4 people and 2 cattle so far. The doctors think they might be able to come up with a blood test, but I can't see poking every colonist every other day to draw blood.
Wonderful. Have we caught any adults yet? Butterworth shook his head.
No, nor do we have very good descriptions, other than that it's about hummingbird size. We're working on it, but I was hoping you might be able to throw in some surveillance drones.
I'll crank up the auto factory and start pumping them out. I'll also see if I can modify the video and audio pickups to be more sensitive to insect sound and movement. Butterworth nodded to me and signed off. I gave orders to Guppy for the changes to the auto factory schedules, then sat back and shook my head. Gross! The Spitz and Faith colonies were done offloading to Romulus. Colonists were staying in temporary quarters until the towns were built. Amy Construction Equipment worked full speed to clear some land and set out street plans. We'd learned from the USE's experience on Vulcan, and we were building a fence right away. The wildlife on Romulus wasn't nearly as big or plentiful, but there was a joke going around about carnivorous rabbits. Everyone was fine with excess caution. The Faith and Spitz colonies were set up on separate continents. The land area on Romulus was divided into 8 land masses, each about the size of Australia, and a number of smaller archipelagos. Separation of nations wouldn't be a problem. The really important item, from my point of view, was that our relatives were now awake. As part of our deal with Cranston, Julia Hendricks and family owned a communicator, so didn't have to schedule time on the colony system. At the appointed hour, I connected to the conference that Riker was advertising. I noted with a chuckle that we were up over 30 bobs subscribing to the feed. I watched as Riker made the call, and Julia came online. A dozen or so random family members jostled for position behind her in the video, and on her lap, with pride of place, was Space Cadet Justin. "Uncle Will!" he yelled. "Hey, Cadet, enjoy the spaceship ride?" I could hear the pride and joy in Riker's voice. I and every other Bob shared it. These were our sister's descendants, and a major reason why we put up with idiots like Cranston and Vehement. I remembered Milo, who had expressed a strong lack of caring about humanity's fate. A momentary wave of sadness washed over me at his memory. I wondered what he would have thought of the current situation. I pulled myself back to the present, where Julia was talking about their experience. Well, trying to. Justin didn't seem willing to give up the floor. "And we went in the big ship and we sat, and it was boring, and then there was a bump, and they took us down a big hallway, and they gave me a needle, which I hated, and they made me sleepy, and they put me in a box." And amazing. He didn't even seem to be stopping to breathe. The soliloquy went on for another minute, while Julia increasingly failed to keep a grin off her face. Finally, having said what he needed to say, he yelled, "Bye, Uncle Weir," and shot out of the frame. This prompted laughter from everyone, family and Bob's both. Julia turned back to Riker with a smile on her face. "He has 2 speeds, asleep and what you just saw." One of the family members, who I remembered as Philip something, leaned forward. "Will, how long until some other colony gets planted on Romulus?" Riker shook his head. "Can't say. We've got 2 more colony ships heading to your system right now, but the Enclave leaders will decide whether they want to settle on Vulcan or Romulus. Howard tells me that Romulus is looking a lot more attractive these days, though." There were chuckles from the family. News of the Raptors had already spread. Riker talked to Julia for a few more minutes, fielded some questions from other family members, and got Julia to promise to call him as soon as they were in private residences. Then, it was over. As Riker hung up the call, I sat back to bask in the peculiar mix of joy, wistfulness, and melancholy that seeing our family always left me with. I had talked with a few other Bobs about it. It seemed to be a common reaction. I guess original Bob wasn't as much of a loner as he'd always claimed. I signed off of the conference call and turned to Guppy, who had been hovering. "What?"
"Colonel Butterworth wants to talk to you. They've caught a parasite adult."
Ugly little bugger.
Hummingbird's size turned out to be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it was still one of the biggest insects I'd ever seen. I didn't much care for insects, and I had an urge to stomp on this one. It looked like some odd combination of hornet and spider with 2 sets of wings. The stinger was particularly nasty looking. Retractable, it could inject eggs in its victim up to an inch deep. I had to turn off my gag reflex watching the necropsy. Well, now we had specifics. I bundled up all the data and shot off an email to Bill asking for suggestions. Then I connected to Butterworth.
Howard, you've seen our new neighbor?
Yeah, not my favorite creature. I've sent something off to Bill, and I've got a couple dozen new drones ready. I'll program them with the data and get them to scan the area, see what we come up with. Butterworth nodded and disconnected. The colonel looked outwardly calm, but I knew this was worrying him. Big things like raptors we could handle. Small stuff? Not so much. Humanity could conceivably end up prisoners in their own homes if we didn't get control of this pest. 21. Attacks continue. Riker, December 2174, Sol. We lost a cargo drone, Charles said, popping into VR. There was an explosive package waiting where it landed. As soon as it touched down, the bomb went off. He sat down and accepted a coffee from Jeeves. It was a supply delivery to Vancouver Island. They've still got enough of a fishery that they're not facing immediate starvation, but the loss of equipment and resources is still painful. I looked up and muttered a few choice expletives. I take it we lost the entire food shipment? Charles nodded. I thought we had the landing area completely secured. Vehement has already claimed responsibility. They're getting trickier. A light blinked on my console. Not surprisingly, it was Premier Grady. I accepted the call. We seem to have lost our delivery, he said without preamble. I saw the announcement. I do not blame you for this. You could just as soon blame me. However, the problem remains of hungry mouths to feed. What can be done? Short term, sir? I'm going to put together another delivery. Homer is in your area, so he'll arrange a time and place over a short-range laser link. No chance of intercepting the communication that way. I turned to look at Homer. He nodded and disappeared. I thought for a second, then turned back to the video call. Meanwhile, I think that Vehement has graduated to major threat. They're not going to go away, and they're no longer just a nuisance. I talked to Grady for a few more moments, going over some backlogged items. Then he looked to his right and announced that he was receiving the connection from Homer. His eyes moved across the video screen for a few moments. Then he turned back to me and nodded. After he disconnected, Charles said, We also have the issue of the Florianopolis attacks. I know, Charles. A lot of people still blame Brazil for the war. I guess they're taking out their frustrations and getting some revenge. We have a task force going on that already. I just don't know how hard they're working on it. There seems to be a lot of sympathy for those terrorist attacks. Less so for the supply chain attacks, even though fewer lives are lost. Charles shrugged. It's closer to home, I guess. There had been sabotage on one of the donuts. Some chemicals had been introduced into the irrigation system and had killed 3 sections of kudzu before the automated systems caught on and shut everything down for inspection. This Vehement group was good. The only people that had legitimate access to the space farms were the Bobs. Since Vehement demonstrably was able to gain access, we had to consider all other means. Ideas for how they might have done it included fake drones controlled by Vehement, stealth devices piggybacking up from Earth on returning delivery vehicles, or even hacking of our legitimate drones. None of those alternatives really seemed realistic, but then that was the thing about being a good hacker. If people saw it coming, you wouldn't be able to get away with it. I set my AMI monitors to reviewing all traffic for the last month. Even if they found nothing, I was at least eliminating possibilities. I was archiving everything, though, in case I got inspired at some later date. Somewhere in all the communications around Earth, there had to be exchanges between Vehement members. I went back to review, yet again, Everything in the library is about cryptography. 22. Fallout. Bob. December 2173, Delta Iridini. Archimedes. Archimedes stopped in mid-step and looked wildly around.
Bob?
I canceled the camouflage on the drone for a moment so he could locate it. He grunted an acknowledgement and settled carefully to the ground to sit, leaning against a tree. I brought the drone down to eye level, then re-engaged the camouflage.
I don't think you're going to be allowed back.
The statement was delivered in a low voice without looking at the drone.
Since you were banished, there have been no attacks.
That's because I've killed 6 hippogriffs so far that we're heading your way, I replied. I was irritated, and I let it show in my tone. Archimedes looked at the drone, eyes wide.
You're still protecting us?
You're still important to me, Archimedes. Especially you and your family. Speaking of which, how is Buster doing? Archimedes smiled fondly.
He wants to help me make tools now. Of course, all he does is bash rocks together, but it's a start.
He lost the smile and looked down for a moment before continuing.
And getting a lot of what you call cold shoulder still. Some of the other cubs have started to tease Buster. I don't want you to go away forever, but I can't have my family affected.
I understand, Archimedes. I still need to get you up to speed with the bow and arrow eventually, but it can wait. The thing to remember is that I didn't wipe out the hippogriffs, just the local nest. As a species, they're still out there, and your area is effectively unclaimed territory for them now. You need to be ready to hold them off. At minimum, you need to have a supply of extra spears, and the bows and arrows will give you more range.
Okay. I've been playing around with the short spears, arrows. I told people they're small spears for Buster. They laugh, but they believe me. The bow part. Why does it have to be different materials?
Laminated material is stronger and has much better spring. Eventually, you'll glue it, but for now, tying is good enough. We talked for a while longer. Plans for new weapons, suggestions for the medicine woman, basic math. I would bring these people out of the Stone Age one way or another. Eventually, Archimedes got up, said goodbye, and headed back to Camelot. It was enough. It was a good day. Marvin had something to say again. I could always tell. He would open his mouth, then close it, then try again. I wasn't sure if I should be concerned or not. Last time, it had been hippogriffs. Not a good track record. Finally, he managed to squeeze it out. I think I'm going to be heading out soon. I froze for almost half a second. As in, leaving Delta Iridini? Yeah, Bob. You've done a lot with the Deltans, but I think it's past the point where it needs 2 of us. This is a caretaker situation now. He made a gesture at the video window I'd been watching. Truthfully, the Council kicking you out was probably a good thing for them. They go back to deciding their own destiny. You can still tweak things here and there, but the Sky God business really wasn't healthy. For you or for them. I thought about being offended, getting mad. But the truth was that I'd been having very similar thoughts. I dropped my eyes and nodded. Still, it won't be the same without you around to give Guppy bad greeting lines. Hell, Bob. With Scut, we're never really out of touch. If I keep my speed below 0.75 C, my tau won't go high enough to preclude VR. I might just seem a little groggy to you. Funny, it still doesn't feel the same. I shrugged and paced back and forth a few times in silence. I guess I understand, though, Marv. It's always been my project. Luke and Bender knew that. Sure wish they'd intercept the Scut Plan's transmission, Marvin commented, changing the subject. It would be nice to know if they're okay. I nodded and sat down. What a crap year this was turning into. On the other hand, Scott did make things a little easier. There were things to do and Bobs to talk to. I shook my head and sighed. The moping was pointless. I would always be able to find a laundry list of things to be depressed about if I worked at it. The Deltons were still there, even if they weren't talking to me at the moment. 23. Vehement. Riker, September 2175, Sol. Pieces of space station mingled with desiccated plants and the carcasses of livestock that had been unlucky enough to be living on that donut. The debris had scattered with the explosion, but orbital mechanics and mutual gravity were bringing everything back together. Homer's image floated in the video window.
We just brought this one online. 6 months' work. Gone.
I nodded silently. The donuts were Homer's babies. He'd come up with the idea and head-manned it to completion. This couldn't be easy for him. Any announcements?
Yeah, vehement. The usual crazy-ass rant. Humanity is a cancer, the universe is better off without them, blah, blah.
I'm sorry, buddy. But we'll get them one way or another. Homer was silent. His expression said everything. Sadness, anger, confusion. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I felt guilty about all the bad thoughts I'd had about him in the past. He was a fully contributing member of the team, and this was killing him. I was concerned about Homer. He had pretty much stopped ribbing me. Hadn't called me number 2 in months. In fact, he seemed to have turned all business. I wondered if someone had offended him, but on the one occasion I'd tried to talk to him about it, he just deflected the conversation. We've got enough redundancy now that this won't leave us dead in the water, I said. But with the reduced planet-side output, it's going to mean short rations, or more kudzu. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. Homer wasn't having any. He shrugged, then ended the connection. Guppy, what have we got relating to Farm 6?
Querying AMI team. 1 moment.
After a short delay, Guppy continued.
No related transmissions detected. No nearby activity except by heaven vessels.
Crap. They were covering their tracks too well. Something will break. Something has to. Guppy didn't comment. He wasn't much on encouragement. Huge, fishy eyes blinked once. Just to really make my week, there were several terrorist attacks on Florianopolis as well. I kept wondering if there was some anniversary coming up that was triggering all the activity. The terrorists were getting smarter and hitting more critical targets. One of the attacks had taken out the power system. It would take a couple of days to fix. It wasn't the first time that the actions of Vehement and the Brazilian attacks seemed to be coordinated. I wondered if there was some connection. It was almost certainly 2 different groups, but maybe they were talking to each other, sharing intelligence. That could actually be of benefit to me. The old Earth, pre-war, had global technology and every form of communications you could imagine. This post-apocalyptic reality was far more limited. There were fewer methods of communication for collusion between the 2 groups, or even crosstalk between Vehement cells. But I'd been monitoring all channels, at least everything I could think of, so either I'd missed some form of communication, or they were using some kind of steganography which would be almost impossible to recognize unless you knew what you were looking for. Or they had gone low-tech. Option 3 would be too slow. Number 1 I couldn't do anything about, so that left 2. Steganography was, by definition, inefficient, since you had to spread the message out enough for it to be unnoticeable. Therefore, the transmission medium would have to allow a high bandwidth, which would immediately rule out a lot of possibilities. And there were statistical methods that could ferret out steganographic messages. I retired to my VR to give this more thought. 24. Visiting Marvin. Bob, March 2174, Delta Eridani. I hadn't had to kill a hippogriff in months. It wasn't clear if they'd learned to avoid the territory or if there simply weren't any left that were close enough to bother the Deltans. Since Marvin's departure, I was handling all the drones myself. I could automate a certain amount of the tasks, but I still eventually had to review the mission recordings. Honestly, I couldn't be bothered. I kept my eye on Archimedes and his family. Probably a little more than I should. I had occasional flashes of myself as the overbearing grandparent who kept wanting to visit. It was an embarrassing image, and I resolved to contact Archimedes a little less often. Marvin was long gone, heading for Pi Cubed Orionis. I think he was hoping for an intelligent species that he could be in charge of. It seemed we actually had a paternal streak, or maybe maternal. He was, as promised, keeping his top speed low enough so that he could still interface via SCUT connection. We found a balance where he frame jacked up a bit and I slowed my time sense some, and we could then interact at the same time rate. It worked. Today I was visiting Marvin. In Delta Eridani, as Senior Bob, I generally played host. It was interesting that traditions and modes of behavior were developing, even among a bunch of post-human computers. Generally, the Senior Bob in any system was in charge and played host to the other Bobs. It made sense to me, which meant it pretty much made sense to all the Bobs. Marvin apparently had a bit of a luxury streak in him. His VR environment was an open-air patio and rancher-style house at the top of a low mountain in a semi-tropical climate. The ocean stretched out in all directions, right out to the horizon. It was a beautiful, if somewhat mundane, scene, except for a couple of anomalies. The very close horizon, the low gravity, and the presence of Earth hanging in the middle of the sky. You know there's no air on the moon, right? I grinned at him. Marvin shrugged. I'm going through all the science fiction books I've read over the years and replicating the environments for a while. It's interesting, and it's good practice at VR programming. I nodded. It wasn't really important. We were stalling, and we both knew it. Finally, I brought up the elephant in the room. My two newest clones, Pete and Victor, are almost ready to leave. Victor is willing to follow the trail of either Luke or Bender. Pete is not interested at all. We have to make a choice. Marvin took a moment to brush his hand through his hair. I remembered that habit from when I was original Bob. Apparently death wasn't enough to remove nervous tics. I guess Pete is adamant? He asked. Yep. Like Milo with Earth. This is the expression of not caring. He's going off in whatever direction he decides on, and that's that. Marvin chuckled. A recurring theme. Great. Well, it's a coin toss then, isn't it? The thing is, Marv, what if something bad happened to both Luke and Bender? They were heading for different stars, but in the same general direction. What if they ran into something? What, like the Borg? It just seems unlikely, Bob. What would be the motive? Don't know. Maybe another Medeiros? We don't really have any information. I shrugged, conceding the point. Well, we'll leave it up to Victor. He'll transmit constantly over SCUT, so we'll know if something happens to him. Marvin nodded, a worried look on his face. 25. Rabbits. Howard, November 2189, Vulcan. There was a call on my queue from one of the biologists. I was a little surprised. Normally, I talked only to Butterworth. Not that there was a rule or anything. Still, curious. I dialed the call. Sheehy. A woman appeared on screen for a moment, then disappeared off frame. I got an impression of thick red hair tied into a ponytail. Dr. Sheehy, this is Howard Johansson returning your call. Her disembodied voice drifted back to the phone. Oh, thanks for getting back to me. Colonel Butterworth wanted me to call you if we had news. We have news. I waited for a moment. And? She returned and grinned into the video. Sorry, I love the drama. Anyway, we have a possible treatment for the vine. Which is? Honestly, Sheehy, keep this up and I'll drop a rock on you. Bunnies. I'm going to drop a rock on you." Dr. Sheehy laughed. I couldn't help noticing that she had a great laugh. Also, freckles, dimples when she laughed. I mentally slapped myself. This could go exactly nowhere. She disappeared again, then returned holding a small section of plant. "Turns out rabbits not only are able to eat the vine, they seem to be attracted to it. I think the toxin is just added flavoring to them. Bad for the vine, good for us." Right, but we still have to expend a lot of effort to harvest the vine and get it to the rabbits. Could just as easily incinerate it. No. Dr. Sheehy shook her head. "Rabbits are self-replicating. Aggressively so. You may have heard." She grinned at me. "And they make great stew." I smiled back at her. There was a certain poetry in the solution. Granted, we'd be unleashing a Terran scourge, even if a fluffy one, on an unsuspecting planet, but Vulcan attacked first. Have you asked Butterworth about it? "He says Council will have to approve, but they're feeling a little humble these days. He thinks he can ram it through." Well, all righty then. Dr. Sheehy paused for a moment before continuing. "You heard about the Bronto attack yesterday?" "Well, attack is not the right word. They tried to eat the fence again." "Yes, and we had to kill one that had figured out that he could just avoid the electrical wires. That's one smart Bronto. IQ up in the 2, maybe 3 range." Dr. Sheehy smiled at her own joke. "Anyway, before they airlifted the carcass away from the clearing, someone got the bright idea to cut off a big hunk of meat. It passed toxicology tests, and it passed the barbecue test, so now Bronto is on the menu. You may find your kudzu sales dropping." Whoa! You were not supposed to be hunting for sustenance until the impact studies are completed. Is the Council good with this? Dr. Sheehy gave me an unbelieving look. Try to picture the Council telling 20,000 people that they have to eat kudzu instead of steak when steak is lumbering around in plain view every day. Can you say lynching? Yeah, okay. Point taken. Well, I still have the Romulan colony market. They don't have Bronto. Dr. Sheehy grinned and shrugged, then disconnected. To be honest, this was good news from my point of view. The more the colonies could do themselves, the less I had to do. I could even conceivably take off in a decade or so. And on that subject, the Guppy-controlled surveillance system wasn't going to build itself. Back to work. 26. Selling Poseidon. Riker, December 2175, Sol. You seem incapable of preventing them from striking at will. Ambassador Gerald seemed to be enjoying the situation, which made his attempts at portraying anger unconvincing. I'd ignored his jibes in the past, but I was getting tired of it. And what have you been able to do, Ambassador? Found the source of those hacking attempts yet? Made any arrests? Got any suggestions? Anything besides endless carping? I exchanged glares with the ambassador for a moment, then moved on. We're working on replacing the donut, but it'll still be a few months, plus whatever time it takes to get the farm regrown. There will be short rations for a while, but no starvation. I had a sudden inspiration, one of those mid-action moments, and added, Vehement got lucky this time. We stopped most of their attempts before they get anywhere. They aren't really that smart. It wasn't true, but baiting them might force some kind of reaction. Vehement depended on fear, and being publicly dissed might provoke a response. Before anyone could comment, I turned off my audio, effectively giving up the floor. I turned to Guppy without moving my avatar. Put everything we have on communications monitoring. I want to know who reacts to my words and how. I want every bite accounted for. Guppy nodded and went into command fugue. The session moved on to the emigration question. The Maldives and Micronesia had pretty much cemented their claim on Poseidon, partly due to lack of interest by the other enclaves. They needed about 600 more people from other enclaves to form a full colony ship complement, but they were having a hard time making that. No one wanted to split off from their group, especially to go to a planet so, specialized. It was attractive to islanders. To everyone else, not so much. At the same time, other groups were trying to lay claim to the semi-completed ships for emigration to Vulcan or Romulus. The whole thing was acrimonious and mostly information-free.
No detectable increase in Earthside traffic. One anomalous communication to Spaceside.
Okay, that was something. Source? Destination?
Source, New Zealand, although not near any population centers. Destination, Homer.
Excuse me?
It was a tight beam signal. It would not have been detectable except for a chance alignment with one of our drones on cleanup duty.
Oh. Shit. That just did not make sense. Why would Homer be helping them? Why would he be sabotaging his own project unless he didn't have a choice? Suddenly, Homer's change in personality took on an ominous cast. It was very un-Homer-like. The complete cessation of jokes. The withdrawal from the rest of us. Perhaps because it wasn't Homer. I sent a message to Charles requesting a physical meetup. 27. Luke returns. Bob, March 2178, Delta Eridani. I walked through the village VR, watching the activity. There had been improvements in the 6 years since I'd been kicked out. I had enough hidden cameras and camouflaged drones around the village now to feed a real-time VR, no more recorded scenes. Archimedes had finally started taking my tent design seriously. A few other couples copied the result, and now there were a half-dozen pretty good facsimiles of teepees scattered through the village. It was the dry season, but once the rains started up again, I expected this innovation to increase in popularity. I was trying to ignore a couple engaging in some very public displays of affection when I received a ping. From Luke! I responded, and he popped in. "Hey, Bob, long time." I grinned and slapped him on the shoulder. "Luke! Good to see you, buddy." Luke appeared momentarily surprised. We've never been physically demonstrative like that. In fact, original Bob was a little standoffish in terms of physical contact. Luke got over it quickly, though, and grinned back at me. "I just went through the whole surprise visit by Bill thing. Apparently, it's a standard hazing ritual." I laughed. "Oh, yes, I went through it, too. You don't expect a VR link across light years, and I noticed that Bill's transmitted plans still don't mention the possibility." "So where are you right now?" "Capaceti. And before you say it, Bill already gave me crap about not picking up his transmissions right away." Luke materialized a coffee, waited while Spike sniffed his hand, and then turned back to me. "I've spent the last several minutes reading blogs. Lots has been happening, apparently." I nodded, knowing he would have caught up on events with the Deltons first thing. "What have you found out your way?" "A super Earth," Luke shrugged. "Absolutely not suitable for colonization. Gravity just over 3G, but a full-on ecosystem. I've been having fun cataloging things, and I've started another load of Bobs." Luke stopped talking as Archimedes came into the VR area, his son trailing him. Buster was almost as tall as his father, and not showing any sign of slowing down. Archimedes had filled out as he reached full adulthood, and wasn't looking at all bookish anymore. The two of them together made a formidable team. They were carrying bows, and had quivers on their backs. Each was carrying some kind of small game, sort of a wild turkey analog, freshly killed. Luke turned to me. "Bows and arrows? Wow, dude, moving things right along." I waved a hand in dismissal. "Sooner or later the hippogriffs will find them again. I want them to be ready." Luke nodded and materialized a lazy boy. "Good to be back. This looks like fun. Where's Marvin?" "He took off a few years ago, right after I got kicked out of Camelot. He keeps in touch, though." "Cool. I'll look him up when I have a moment. Heard from Bender?" I shook my head. "No, and I have no idea why. One of my clones has followed his flight plan and should be able to report something in a year or two." Luke nodded. I materialized the couch and coffee table set up and got comfortable. There's always time to get caught up with old friends. 28. Et tu, Homer. Riker, December 2175. Sol. There was seldom any reason for the Bobs to meet physically these days. Scud and VR meant we could do everything we needed to in virtual space. Scud-equipped drones made distance irrelevant for remote administration as well. Now, two heaven vessels floated, 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 two